The wind that blew across Blackthorn Moor carried the sad cry of far-off birds, and the smell of wet flowers smashed under feet no one could see. I remember as clearly as I felt the cold air that night, how the fog rolled in low and quiet over the wide, dark land, covering every dip in the ground like a secret. Somewhere past the curtain of fog, someone's life had been put out, and a mystery began that seemed as old as the moor itself, wild, not calm, and dangerous. In places like this, people doing bad things can find plenty of shadows to hide in, but the truth often leaves a clue behind, just waiting for a smart eye to find it. It was on that gloomy edge of the world that I found myself once more next to Sherlock Holmes, as he stared into the heart of what was not known and pulled out answers where other people saw only darkness. If you feel pulled into this dark story of clues and excitement, I ask you to stay with us as the case unfolds. Your company makes the story stronger. And if you want to be part of more adventures, think about showing your support by subscribing, by giving a thumbs up, and by sharing this story with others who find comfort in the gaslight glow of mystery. It was on one of those gray afternoons, when London was covered by its usual blanket of fog, that I found myself sitting in our normal rooms at Baker Street, watching my friend with a special kind of wonder that never went away, no matter how long I knew him. Holmes sat in his armchair, the smoke from his pipe curling up in soft spirals. His eyes half closed, his mind, if I rate his face correctly, busy with some kind of math problem inside his head that pulled him far away from the normal world. The gas light flickered softly against the window panes, turning the fog outside into a glowing sheet, and the quiet clip-clop of horse-drawn cabs drifted through the window like sounds from another world. It was in moments like these that I often thought about the strange difference between the busy life of London outside and the calm but serious feeling of our living room inside. To any visitor, the messy pile of science tools, the violin left carelessly across the table, and the stack of newspapers might seem like just the junk of men living alone. But to me, every object told a story of past adventures, of puzzles solved, and of dangers we had just barely escaped. I had barely finished these thoughts when a sudden knock, sharp and pressing, broke the quiet. Holmes's eyes opened right away, bright with excitement, as if he had been waiting for the sound all along. "Come in," he called, and the door opened to show a person half lost in the darkness of the hallway. A man stepped forward, his face pale in the glow of the lamp, his heavy coat covered with tiny drops of water from the fog. He brought with him the feeling of someone being chased by unseen things, for his eyes darted around without resting, and his gloved hands squeezed his hat with a nervous energy. "You will forgive me for coming so late, gentlemen," he began, his voice shaking somewhere between being tired and trying to hold back excitement. But I was told, in fact it was made very clear to me, that if I ever found myself almost without hope, I must come here. They said that Mr. Sherlock Holmes is the only man who may bring light where there is only darkness. Holmes tilted his head, pointing toward the chair across from his own. "Please have a seat, sir. You are free to forget being polite, for when something is this important, we don't need to be formal. I can tell that your trip has been both long and rushed, and that the problem that brings you here is not a normal one." The stranger's eyes grew wide. "You are correct, Mr. Holmes. I come from Blackthorn, a lonely village in the north, right next to the moor. And there, on that empty land, something most terrible has happened. A man is dead in a way so strange, so evil, that the whole area is filled with fear. There are whispers of more than just a crime, talk of ghosts, of lights on the moor, of a curse that has taken its victim." At this, Holmes leaned forward, his sharp eyes locked on our visitor. The tired feeling that had covered him moments before fell away, replaced by that hawk-like focus which showed his mind was waking up. I admit, as for myself, that a chill ran down my spine, not because of the talk of curses, for Holmes had taught me too well in the ways of logic, but for the pure fear in the man's voice, a fear that seemed to come not from make-believe, but from something horrible he had lived through. "Your name, sir?" Holmes asked. "Edmund Fairfax," came the answer. "I am the manager of Blackthorn House, the home that stands on the very edge of the moor. It was my master who was found dead without a mark on him, except for a look of terror frozen on his face." Holmes tapped the end of his pipe against the fireplace, his eyes never leaving the man. "Details, Mr. Fairfax, the smallest, the strangest, the ones that are hardest to explain. Tell me all of those." The manager swallowed hard, then began his story, while outside the fog grew thicker against the window panes, as though London itself was leaning in to hear of the dark news brought from the wild north. Fairfax's voice shook at first, as if every word carried with it some awful memory, but under Holmes's steady gaze he found his courage. He told us how his master, Sir Alaric Blackthorn, had returned just 2 weeks before from a trip to other countries, a man who was serious and had strange habits, who liked the loneliness of his moorland home more than the fun of the city. On the evening of his death, Sir Alaric had eaten dinner alone in the oak-walled hall, sending his servants away early and telling them to bolt the doors. It was not until morning, when no one inside was moving, that Fairfax dared to go inside, only to find his master sitting in his high-backed chair, stiff, without life, his face twisted in a look of terrible fear. "There was no wound, no sign of a fight," Fairfax whispered, "but the room itself seemed messed up, as if some unseen hand had passed through it. The candlesticks had burned out, though there was still wax left to burn. His glass of red wine stood half full, untouched. And this is the strangest of all. On the window ledge above him lay a few black feathers, though the window had been locked from the inside." Holmes's eyes narrowed. "Black feathers, you say? And you are certain the windows had not been messed with?" "Certain," Fairfax replied, his hands tightening on the edge of his hat. "The bolts were locked, the window panes were not broken. It is as though the feathers had appeared by some evil magic. Since that time, the villagers talk of the Moor taking him, of some ghost bird that cries in the night. They are afraid, Mr. Holmes? And though I don't believe in such stories, I admit that I, too, feel the weight of some unseen danger." Holmes stood up, walking with quick, quiet steps, his dressing gown sweeping behind him. He paused by the window, looking out into the fog, then turned suddenly. "Watson, you remember the strange case of the speckled band? There are similarities here, though feathers instead of a snake, terror instead of poison. Mr. Fairfax, your master's death may have nothing to do with old stories, yet everything to do with a clever plan." I watched Fairfax's face turn pale, though a small spark of hope appeared in his eyes at Holmes's words. "Then you will come?" he asked with excitement. "You will see for yourself the moor, the house, the room where he died?" "Yes, indeed," Holmes replied with a spark that told me his mind had already jumped far ahead. "The smell of this mystery is strong, and it leads us to the north. Make whatever plans you need to. Watson and I will go with you on the morning train." With that, Fairfax seemed to slump in his chair, as though the heavy weight he had carried alone now found shoulders strong enough to hold it. He stood up, bowed stiffly, and left, his footsteps fading down the stairs into the night. The door closed, leaving us once more in the dim light of our room. Holmes stood silent for a moment, then struck a match to light his pipe again. The flame lit up his sharp face, which wore that strange mix of being distant and excited that I had seen in him when danger was near. "What do you think, Watson?" he asked at last. "That we are heading to a dark country, Holmes," I replied. "The moor is a place I have always thought was haunted, even without stories of ghosts, and if there is indeed a murderer around, then he is one who uses terror as his weapon. Holmes's eyes twinkled. Exactly. It is the planning of the fear that interests me. Fear is a very strong tool, and those who know how to use it can push men to ruin without hitting them. We shall see, my dear friend, whether the person who made this plan has woven his story too cleverly, or whether it can still be torn apart by logic. The clock on the fireplace chimed the hour. Outside, the foghorn on the river made its sad sound, as though repeating the call we had just received. I already felt the weight of Blackthorn Moor pressing on us, even though we had not yet left London. And so began the case of the murder on the edge of the moor, whose shadows were meant to stretch far beyond the lonely house where death had paid its visit. The next morning found us at Euston Station, our breath turning to steam in the cold air as we stood among the busy porters and travelers. The fog, always loyal to London, held on tightly to the iron arches above, blurring the lamps into circles of pale light. Holmes walked beside me with focused energy, his thin body wrapped in a travel cloak, his sharp eyes already far away, as though looking at the wild land that was waiting for us. Fairfax, pale and serious, joined us on the platform, and with few words we got on the northbound train, our rooms filling with the smell of coal smoke and wet wool. The train jerked forward, carrying us away from the crowded heart of the city into a countryside that slowly lost its neatness. At first, there were neat hedges and fields with little cottages, their chimneys sending up thin lines of smoke into the winter air. Then the villages became fewer, the trees more twisted, and the sky more gloomy, heavy with banks of gray cloud. I watched through the glass as the land changed, and a feeling of doom came over me. For it seemed as though with each passing mile we lost another layer of comfort, going deeper into a world untouched by new inventions. Holmes, meanwhile, stayed focused on the details Fairfax gave him. He questioned him with a sharpness that seemed both nonstop and strangely calming, pulling out each fact with great care. How had Sir Alaric acted in the days before his death? Had he argued with anyone? Had he spoken of fears or of enemies? Fairfax answered as best he could. Sir Alaric had been a man who kept to himself, proud and strict, who liked to take lonely rides across the moor, often returning at strange hours, his boots muddy and his face looking tired. His only company, other than his servants, had been a visitor now, and then from the nearby village, a schoolteacher with whom he talked late into the night about things no servant overheard. And this schoolteacher, Holmes asked. His name? Henry Kettle, Fairfax replied. A man with not much money, but who has read a lot of books. Some say he was once meant to be a church minister, though why he chose instead the life of a village teacher, I cannot say. My master seemed to like his company more than anyone else's. Holmes made a soft sound in his throat, a sound of interest rather than a comment. He took out his notebook and wrote a few short lines, his long fingers moving with quick sureness, then went back to his seat and stared into the distance. As the hours passed, the train pushed deeper into the northern wilds. The stations where we stopped grew smaller, their platforms lined with rough-faced men in heavy coats, their voices carrying accents thick with the sound of the moor. At one such stop, a young woman got on, her shawl pulled tightly around her head, and threw a nervous look in Fairfax's direction. He stiffened, and for a moment I thought he might speak, but the girl quickly looked away and turned around. Holmes watched this happen without a word, though the small upward curve of his lips told me he had seen and understood it all. I knew better than to ask him directly. In time the meaning, or lack of it, would be shown. By late afternoon, the light had started to fade. The land outside grew harsh and sad, the fields turning into stretches of rough ground and tangled bushes. Then, as the train went around a bend, the moor suddenly appeared. A huge rolling sea of flowers and swamp, stretching to the horizon under a sky as empty as the land it covered. It was as though we had passed through a curtain into another world, one where nature ruled with grim power, and man's presence seemed like a weak interruption. Holmes leaned forward, his eyes shining. "There lies our stage, Watson," he murmured, "and the play has already begun." The train rattled on into the growing darkness, its whistle echoing sadly across the moor. As the daylight faded, the lamps inside our room were lit, making a warm glow that only seemed to make the wilderness outside the window more intense. The moor appeared endless, its shapes blurred by mist, with groups of short trees here and there, rising like guards against the horizon. Every so often, a flicker of movement suggested a shepherd or traveler, but no person stayed in sight for long. The land seemed to swallow them whole. Fairfax spoke in a low voice, pointing toward a faint light flickering far off in the darkness. That would be the village of Blackthorn. Few people live there, and few are still out after dark. They say the moor is unkind to strangers, and does not forgive those who try to control it. His words carried not just old stories, but a kind of tired belief, as though he himself had tested the moor's personality and found it unfriendly. Holmes looked at him sharply. "And yet your master chose to stay there, right in the face of its loneliness." "Sir Alaric often said he got strength from the moor," Fairfax replied, "that its silence calmed his mind, and its air gave him a new way of seeing things. But there were times when I thought he listened too closely to the wind, as though it whispered to him secrets no one else could hear. He grew restless after he returned from his trip, restless and tired." Holmes's forehead wrinkled just a tiny bit, but he made no comment. He only reached for his watch, noted the time, and put it back in his pocket. Such actions in him were never without a reason. I knew he was marking the rhythm of events as carefully as one would a clock, storing them to rebuild later with his amazing exactness. At last the train slowed, and with a final screech of its brakes, we pulled up to a small station sitting at the very edge of the moor. The platform was little more than a stretch of worn-out wooden boards, lit by a single sputtering lamp that shook in the rising wind. No busy porters waited for us here. Only a single cart stood ready, its driver wrapped in a rough cloak, his lantern swaying. We got off into the raw air, which bit at the lungs and carried with it the smell of peat and still water. The cart driver tipped his cap, his eyes looking away from ours as Fairfax exchanged a few short words with him. Our bags were quickly put away, and we climbed on, the wooden wheels creaking as the horse started us on the narrow track that led toward the village. The journey that followed was one of heavy silence. The road twisted through dips and hills, with flowers on either side that rustled like whispers when the wind passed over them. From time to time the horse jumped, though nothing was there to see except for the low-hanging fog. The driver muttered a curse, pushing the animal on, while Holmes leaned forward, his gaze cutting through the gloom. "There," he murmured suddenly, pointing toward the darkness ahead. For a moment I saw it too. A shaky light moving low to the ground, gliding across the moor at a speed no man could keep up. Then just as quickly it was gone. The driver made the sign of the cross, his hands tightening on the reins. "The bog lantern," he said in a hoarse voice. "Many a traveler has seen it. It leads you the wrong way, pulls you from the path, and once you follow, the moor swallows you whole." Holmes said nothing, though I caught the sharp glint in his eye as he glanced at Fairfax. The manager looked pale, his lips pressed tightly together, but he gave no reply. The cart pushed on, and at last, through the fog, the shapes of the village appeared, a group of low cottages huddled together, as if for warmth, against the huge emptiness. Beyond it, looking darker than the night itself, stood the shape of Blackthorn House, its chimneys rising like watchtowers on the edge of the moor. I felt a shiver I couldn't control. There, against the wilderness, stood the House of Secrets, and inside its walls waited the mystery that had called us from Baker Street. The cartwheels ground to a stop before the iron gates of Blackthorn House, their bars wet with mist, their hinges screeching like some unwilling guard when Fairfax pushed them open. Beyond lay a gravel path, pale in the lantern light, leading to the dark shape of the house itself. It stood as if it grew there against the moor, a great square building of stone, its pointed roofs cutting sharply into the low clouds, its windows black and unwelcoming. Only one upper window showed a flicker of light, shaking as though it couldn't decide whether to keep burning or go out in the drafts that blew around the place. We got down, our footsteps crunching on the path, while the driver hurriedly turned his horse and went back down the road with hardly a goodbye, as though the house itself breathed out an air too heavy to bear. Fairfax led us up the steps, his key scraping in the lock before the heavy door gave way. A breath of stale air met us, smelling of smoke long put out, and a faint hint of damp stone. Inside, the hall stretched wide, hung with pictures of family members whose eyes glimmered faintly in the lantern glow, following our entrance with that strange blame only oil paints seems to be able to show. Holmes set his hat aside, his gaze sweeping the space with a sharpness that made every beam, every tapestry, every forgotten object looked at in an instant. "Your master valued history," he remarked softly, noticing the suits of armor standing guard in the shadows. Yet he lived in a place where the past weighs heavily on the present. A strange choice for a man returned from traveling abroad. Fairfax tilted his head, but gave no reply, instead leading us deeper into the house. Our footsteps echoed against the stone floors as he led us into the room where Sir Alaric had met his end. The great hall stretched before us, its oak walls darkened by centuries, its long table cleared, except for the place where the master had eaten. The chair at its head remained pulled slightly back, as though waiting for a person who would never return. "There," Fairfax whispered, pointing toward it. "This is how I found him, Mr. Holmes, and it is here that no servant will walk after dark." Holmes moved forward, his lantern throwing huge, scary shadows against the carved beams. He bent low over the chair, his fingers tracing the wood, then straightened to check the window above, on whose ledge the mysterious feathers had been found. None were there now, but I could almost picture them, black against the pale stone, like a sign left by unseen hands. I admit the feeling in the room weighed on me so heavily that I found myself glancing again and again toward the dark corners, half expecting some being to move. Holmes, however, seemed full of energy. He walked around the room with quick steps, pausing to note a candle end here, the mark of a glass on the table there. He drew from his pocket a magnifying glass and checked a part of the floor where the boards had faint dents. "Remarkable," he murmured, more to himself than to us. "The smallest marks, and yet they say so much. Fairfax, when the body was removed, was its position moved?" "No, sir," Fairfax said quickly. "I made sure of it myself. Only the doctor from the village touched him, and even then nothing was moved more than it had to be." Holmes nodded, then turned to the fireplace. There the ashes lay cold, though I could see pieces of half-burnt paper among them. He stirred them lightly with the poker, his eyebrows coming together in focus. "Watson, make a note of this," he said. "Not what was destroyed, but what was saved by accident or by purpose." The room fell silent, except for the faint sighing of the wind against the windows. In that silence, the weight of Blackthorn House pressed upon us, as though the very walls held secrets, waiting for their moment to come out. Holmes crouched by the fireplace, carefully sifting through the fragile pieces with a surgeon's care. A few blackened corners of paper could still be read, scraps of handwriting, though too little was left to give more than the idea of rushed writing. He lifted one piece to the light, its edges crumbling as he turned it. "A letter," he said, half to himself. "Part of a letter, thrown into the flames in a hurry. The handwriting is strong, but uneven at the end. The ink is thick, poured heavily, as though the writer's hand was shaking. One cannot say if Sir Alaric himself wrote it, or if another person did it for him. He replaced the piece gently. In either case, destruction was planned. What was it, I wonder, that needed to be silenced so badly it had to be fed to the fire? Fairfax stood at a polite distance, his lantern shaking in his hand. "I did not know of it, sir. The servants swear nothing was mailed that evening." Holmes stood up and swept his eyes once more across the room. "It is always this way," he said quietly. "The smallest clue shows the deepest secret. A man does not burn letters in the fireplace of his dining room without a reason. Remember this moment, Watson. It is often not the clue itself, but the effort to hide it that cries out loud." I nodded, though my eyes drifted uneasily to the great chair where Sir Alaric had been found. Even now, empty, it seemed to give off some leftover feeling of his final terror. One could almost see the stiff body, the eyes fixed in fear, the hand half lifted as if to block some invisible attacker. The silence pressed in so heavily that when a sudden creak sounded above us, I jumped, my hand automatically tightening on my walking stick. Fairfax glanced upward, his face tightening. "The servants' rooms are above," he murmured. "But I sent them away early this evening as I promised. We are alone here, gentlemen." Holmes's lips curved in the faintest of smiles. "Alone, and yet not unwatched, I think. This house listens." His words hung in the still air, and I could not decide if he was joking or serious. After a bit he turned from the fireplace, his mood changing from thinking to action. "We have seen what we must for tonight. Tomorrow, with the daylight on our side, I will check the grounds, the windows, and the path to the moor. For now, Watson, let us make a note of what we have learned. A man dies without a wound, terror on his face, feathers on the sill, and fire eating a letter. These are the points on which the case now rests." We left the hall, the door closing heavily behind us, as though sealing in the ghost of what had happened. Fairfax led us along a dim hallway to the guest rooms prepared for us. Mine was large but gloomy, its stone walls draped with faded cloth, its single candle casting more shadow than light. Holmes took the next room, though I knew well he would not sleep easily, his mind already cutting up the pieces of evidence with endless energy. When at last I lay down, the chill of the moor seemed to leak through the very stones, and the silence of the house pressed on me like a weight. Somewhere in the distance, the wind moaned across the flowers, rising and falling like a sad song. And yet faintly beneath that natural cry, I thought I heard another sound. The flutter of wings, soft, insistent, and gone almost before it was made. I rose and pressed my ear to the shuttered window, but there was nothing, only the huge emptiness of the moor beyond. Still, I could not get rid of the feeling that Blackthorn House and the land around it held secrets that would not stay hidden for long. This is how our first night on the edge of the moor ended, where fear seemed to live not just in the hearts of men, but in the very stones of the house itself. The morning that broke over Blackthorn Moor was a pale thing, more shadow than light, as if the sun itself did not want to bother such an empty landscape. I woke to the sound of a rooster crowing faintly from the village, though it was muffled as if the fog soaked up even that ancient cry of life. Holmes was already up when I joined him, his thin body outlined against the window, his gaze fixed on the moor, stretching away in endless folds of gray and brown. "Look, Watson," he said, without turning his head. "The ground is heavy with dew. The soil, when soft, holds marks longer than when baked hard by the sun. If ever the earth is to give its story, it is on a morning like this." I armed myself with a stick and coat, and together with Fairfax, who had the tired look of a man who had barely slept, we stepped out into the raw air. The village was still sleeping. Smoke rose lazily from a few chimneys, and the only sound was the crunch of our boots on the gravel. Once past the house, the moor opened up before us, huge and silent, its surface a mix of flowers, swamp, and rock. The mist clung low to the ground, shifting in uneasy bits as though stirred by some invisible breath. Holmes walked swiftly, every movement alive with energy. He stopped first at the garden gate, where he bent down to look at the damp earth. With his magnifying glass in hand, he traced faint marks I would never have noticed. A messy pattern of footprints, some deep, others shallow, as though the same man had walked both firmly and lightly. 2 sets of prints on top of each other, Holmes murmured. One returning, one leaving, though not by the same path. And here, he pointed to a piece of flower broken cleanly at the stem, a change no simple wind would cause. Fairfax bent to look, his face tense. We kept to the path last night. No servant went beyond it. Indeed, Holmes replied, his voice sharp with interest. Then whose feet were these? They are not yours, Mr. Fairfax, nor do they look like my own or Watson's. We shall follow. He led us beyond the gate, across a stretch of swampy ground, where the flowers grew thick and the footing was unsafe. The prints wound in a shaky way, going first toward a low hill, then turning sharply to the left, as though the person who made them was trying to avoid something unseen. At times Holmes stopped, his eyes narrowing as he checked the depth of the marks, his mind rebuilding the walk, the speed, the very doubt of the walker. At last the trail brought us to a dip where the ground sank into a patch of peat. There the prints ended suddenly at the very edge, as if the walker had taken one step further and vanished. The soil was soft, dangerous, and oozed with dark water, swallowing anything that pressed too close. Fairfax shuddered. Many a sheep has been lost in such places. A man, too, if he is careless. Holmes crouched, his gaze fixed on the bog's surface. Careless or on purpose. Note, Watson, the last footprint. It holds the weight of the whole body, pressed downward as though the step was taken in a hurry or while being chased. Yet there is no return print, no mark of rescue or escape. The moor itself has eaten the trail. The silence of the place was heavy, broken only by the soft drip of water from the reeds. I admit a chill passed through me, for the thought of a man vanishing into the very earth gave the mystery a ghostly feel. Holmes alone seemed energized, his face lit up with the thrill of the chase, even when the person he was hunting was no longer visible to human eyes. "Come, Watson," he said at last, standing up. "The ground speaks, though it whispers faintly. We must learn its language fully before the day grows old." We pushed further out onto the moor, the mist shifting around us like a living thing. Each gust of wind brought with it a group of strange sounds, a distant cry of a bird, the bleating of sheep somewhere hidden by the hills, the hollow murmur of water seeping under the bog. Holmes moved like a hunting dog on a scent, pausing to look closely at a broken stem here, a moved stone there. To me these signs seemed like nothing more than the random changes of nature, yet to his eyes they became words in a secret language. At last we reached the top of a low hill, from which the whole view of Blackthorn Moor lay visible in its gloomy size. The house crouched behind us like a fort, its chimneys sending up faint ribbons of smoke. Ahead stretched mile upon mile of emptiness, broken only by patches of short gorse and the occasional dark line of a stone wall that had fallen down. It was there, on a slope of flowers, that Holmes gave a low cry and dropped to his knees. "Watson, look," he said, pointing. "Here is the rest of our trail." I bent down, and though the ground looked to me much the same as everywhere else, I soon saw the faint outline of a footprint, long, narrow, pressed deep at the toe, as though the man had hurried uphill. A second and third followed, uneven, then steadier, forming a line that led toward a group of rocks sticking out of the moor like the broken teeth of some buried giant. Holmes followed with excitement. Fairfax and I closed behind. When we reached the rocks, we found a narrow path between them, barely wide enough for a man to pass. The ground here was covered with feathers, dark, ragged things, damp from the mist, clinging to the stone as though some bird had struggled or burst apart in a violent flight. Fairfax made the sign of the cross. "Those are the same feathers I saw on the window ledge," he whispered. "What evil sign is following us?" Holmes turned one feather over between his fingers, his face unreadable. "Raven," he said at last, "or crow. Common enough on the moor. Yet their being here in such a large number is not easily explained." He bent down to check the soil, which was disturbed, as though something heavy had been dragged or pressed against it. "Watson," he continued, "place your hand on this stone. Do you feel the dampness?" I did as he asked, and found the surface clammy, almost slimy to the touch. Holmes's eyes gleamed. "Water stains," he said. "New? And yet we are far from the bog. Someone waited here, perhaps hid here, while the moor hid his path." A sudden gust of wind swept through the rocks, carrying with it a sound that made my blood run cold. It was like the low moan of a horn, distant yet clear, rising and falling with the wind. Fairfax gripped my arm, his face white. "That is the cry they speak of in the village. They say it comes when the moor takes another soul." Holmes, however, only straightened up, his lips curved in a thin line of satisfaction. "Old stories are just a cover, Watson. Behind it lies a plan, and the more decorated the cover, the more desperate the planner." We stayed a while longer, Holmes tracing the ground with non-stop focus, until at last the trail ended suddenly on bare stone. The moor gave us no more. With darkness coming, we turned back toward the house, the mist closing behind us like a curtain. As we walked, I could not shake the image of those black feathers, clinging to the rocks like pieces of a riddle. Whatever hand had scattered them seemed not only to make fun of being found, but to call on fear itself as a partner. And in the heart of that fear, I felt sure, lay the key to Sir Alaric's death. Night came down quickly upon Blackthorn, the moor swallowing the last of the daylight in a blanket of gray that deepened into black. Inside the village, a few lamps flickered to life, their glow small and shaky against the huge darkness pressing in from every side. Holmes, always hating to be idle, suggested we walk down into the village, to hear with our own ears the gossip and fears that Fairfax had described. The path wound steeply down from the house, the gravel crunching under our feet as the mist thickened around us. From cottage to cottage, faint candlelight gleamed through shutters, and the smell of peat smoke mixed with the damp air. At the heart of the little town stood a simple inn, its sign swinging sadly in the wind. The glow of its windows promised warmth, and the quiet murmur of voices inside hinted at men gathered against the gloom. Holmes entered without hesitating, his presence making the group gathered there quiet down. Farmers in rough coats, shepherds with worn faces, and a pair of workers hunched over their mugs turned their eyes on us. Fairfax's arrival caused another stir, some men nodding in serious recognition, others whispering behind their hands. We took our seats near the fireplace, where the fire crackled with an energy that seemed almost brave against the moor's creeping chill. Holmes ordered a small glass of brandy and leaned back, his sharp gaze sweeping the room, noticing every detail: the mud on the boots of one man, the shaking in the hands of another, the worried looks passed at the mention of Blackthorn House. After a bit, an older man with a gray beard leaned forward from his bench and spoke to Fairfax. "They say the master's spirit walks, Mr. Fairfax. They say it was the moor itself that took him. We've heard the cries in the night, the wailing of birds, the flicker of lights where no lamp should burn. You've seen it too, haven't you?" Fairfax stiffened, his lips pressed into a thin line, but Holmes interrupted smoothly. "What exactly have you seen, my good man?" Describe it as though to a man who has never set foot here before. The inn fell silent. All ears turned toward the old man. He paused, his eyes darting to the others, and spoke in a low voice. It was 2 nights before Sir Alaric died. I was returning from the fields when I saw it, the lantern light bouncing across the bog. At first, I thought it was some traveler lost in searching, but it moved too quickly, too smoothly. It skimmed the ground like a ghost light. And then from the darkness came a cry not of man nor animal, but something in between, like the moan of the wind, yet not the wind. I did not dare to follow. A murmur of agreement rippled through the room. Another man added, "My boy swears he saw a great black shape on the hill, wings spread out against the moon. A crow, perhaps, but too large for any crow, and when he blinked, it was gone." Holmes listened, his face calm, yet his eyes sharpened with every word. "And tell me," he said softly, "has such talk started only since Sir Alaric's death, or did it trouble you before?" The men exchanged uneasy looks. At last the bearded one admitted, "There have always been whispers, strange sounds, strange lights. But never death, sir. Never until now." Holmes tilted his head seriously, as though listening to a witness in a court of law. But I, watching closely, saw the faint tightening of his mouth, the mark of a man who has begun to see the shape of truth behind the cover of fear. Holmes allowed the silence that followed to hang there, his long fingers steepled under his chin. He knew, as I had often seen, that men show more in the spaces between their words than in the words themselves. The crackle of the fire filled the quiet, along with the occasional creak of the inn's beams under the pressure of the wind. At last, Holmes leaned forward, his voice so calm and exact that it seemed to command the room without effort. "Gentlemen, fear is a strange thing. It takes a single event, makes it bigger, and casts its shadow over all that follows. But let's imagine that these lights and cries are not ghosts at all. Let's imagine they are tricks, things made by human hands to look like wonders. What then happens to your terror?" A nervous laugh sounded from one corner and was quickly shushed. The old bearded man shifted uncomfortably. "You speak with confidence, sir, but we know what we saw. A light that drifts where no man may walk. A sound that chills the blood. How can such things be made?" Holmes smiled faintly. "That is exactly what I plan to discover." He stood up, his tall and commanding presence against the firelight. "Old stories are the enemy of logic. Yet they are the friend of the clever man who wants to hide his work. Somewhere in these stories is a hand guiding them, pushing them, making use of them. Find that hand, and the mystery disappears." I saw the villagers watching him with faces that mixed wonder and doubt. Some made the sign of the cross, others whispered low, but no one dared to challenge him further. Fairfax, for his part, stayed silent, though his eyes showed both relief and worry. Relief that Holmes had taken control of the story, and worry that the truth might yet be darker than the villagers' fears. When at last we left, the night had deepened into a velvet darkness. Only the faint glow of the inn remained behind us, swallowed quickly by the mist. Holmes walked briskly up the path, his cloak blowing in the wind. I hurried to keep up, my stick tapping against the stones, while Fairfax followed with a heavy walk. "You see, Watson," Holmes murmured, "how quickly rumors spread, and how greedily men feed on them. The light on the bog becomes a ghost lantern. The cry of a bird becomes the moan of the dead. The human mind, once it is infected, makes everything it touches bigger. Yet there is a plan in it. Of that, I am sure. Someone is getting something from the spread of fear." "Getting something?" I asked, surprised. How could such stories lead to a reward? Holmes's eyes gleamed in the darkness. "That, my dear fellow, is the main point of the problem. Fear is a lever, and with it one, may move even the bravest hearts. Sir Alaric's death has given new weight to old legends. We must learn who among these people stands tallest because of that weight. We reached Blackthorn House at last, its windows dark, its large shape outlined against the stars. As we entered, I thought the air inside was even colder than outside, as though the very walls had soaked up the moor's chill. Holmes paused in the hall, listening. Then he turned sharply to Fairfax. "Double the bolts tonight, and keep a lantern burning. I would not have our visitor," he gestured toward the shadows, "slip so easily into our company as he did your master's." Fairfax obeyed without question, though I saw his hands tremble on the lock. As we climbed the stairs, the sound of the wind rose once more, and somewhere beyond the shuttered windows came that same unearthly cry we had heard on the moor. It rose, shook, and fell, leaving the silence deeper than before. Holmes glanced at me, his eyes bright in the gloom. "There it is again, Watson. The voice of the moor, or the voice of a man. Tomorrow we shall decide which." The morning brought little cheer, though the fog had lifted some, showing the moor in its stark largeness. Gray clouds drifted low, and the wind whispered through the flowers as though carrying the voices of 100 hidden souls. Holmes was already in the dining room when I came down. Seated at the long oak table with a tray of cold meats before him, though he had barely touched the food. His mind, as always, had been eating other things. Fairfax entered shortly after, his face tired and his step unsure. He greeted us with the politeness of duty, yet there was in his eyes a flicker of worry that seemed more than just being tired. Holmes looked at him sharply, then said with that quiet directness that was his most tricky weapon, "Mr. Fairfax, you are a man carrying the weight of knowledge. Will you get rid of that weight freely, or must I pull each piece of string from you one by one?" The manager jumped, his hands tightening on the back of a chair. I do not know what you mean, sir." Holmes leaned forward, his gaze as sharp as the point of a knife. "On the night of your master's death, you saw something more than you have told us. A man in your job does not miss the smallest detail. And yet, when you described the room, your eyes avoided the fireplace. That avoidance speaks louder than words." Fairfax's lips parted and closed again. He sank into the chair, his shoulders slumped. "It is true," he said in a hoarse voice. "I did see something, but I did not dare to speak, for who would believe me? And what if by speaking I made myself look guilty?" "Truth only makes the guilty look guilty," Holmes replied. "And guilt will find its target, whether it is hidden or admitted. Tell us what you saw." Fairfax's gaze flickered to me, as though looking for safety in my less sharp eyes. Then, with a shake in his voice, he continued, "When I entered the hall that morning, before calling the doctor, I saw on the fireplace a scrap of paper that had not yet burned. It had but a single word on it, 'Beware.' I grabbed it, planning to show it to the doctor, but by the time I returned, it had crumbled in my pocket. I memorized it, yet I was afraid to speak of it, for wouldn't all suspicion fall on me, the only man who had touched it?" Holmes's face did not soften, but a light of interest gleamed in his eyes. "And you believed hiding it would protect you?" "No, Mr. Fairfax, it is hiding things that casts the darkest shadow. Still, this word 'beware,' who was it for? Your master, or some other person who happened to see it?" Fairfax spread his hands, helpless. "I cannot tell." But Sir Alaric had seemed troubled in those last days. He would walk the halls at night, muttering about debts, about bad deals. Once I heard him whisper the name of Henry Kettle, though whether in anger or in pleading I could not say. Holmes stood up suddenly, his face lit up with a decision. "Then Henry Kettle we must see. A man who talks nightly with your master, who may hold his secrets, and whose name falls from his lips at the hour of fear. Such a man cannot stand outside this case. Come, Watson." We will find him in his village schoolroom before the day gets too late." As Fairfax bowed his head, I thought I saw tears gather at the corners of his eyes, though he turned quickly away. His confession hung in the air like smoke, half clearing the room, half darkening it, and I, though moved by sympathy, could not shake the sense that under his sadness lay some deeper secret yet to be found. The road to the village wound down through flowers and stone, a narrow track whose silence was broken only by the crunch of our boots and the endless sigh of the wind. Holmes walked with long, eager steps, his cloak whipping behind him, his eyes fixed as if already on the person of Henry Kettle. For my part, I felt a growing worry. The manager's news of the word "beware" had struck me with the force of a dark prediction, and I could not get rid of the image of Sir Alaric, seated in fear, his last moments haunted by that scary warning. The schoolhouse stood at the edge of the village, a low stone building with ivy clinging stubbornly to its walls. Inside we found the teacher alone, arranging chalkboards on the desks. He was a tall, thin man of maybe 40 years, with a long face, thin lips, and eyes that gleamed with a smartness that was almost harsh. He greeted us politely, though his way of acting had the stiffness of someone used to giving orders in small groups. "Mr. Henry Kettle?" Holmes asked, his voice carrying both politeness and quiet power. "At your service, sir," the man replied, though his gaze flickered with curiosity. "You are strangers here. My name is Sherlock Holmes. This is my partner, Dr. Watson. We are looking into the recent death of Sir Alaric Blackthorn." At once a shadow crossed Kettle's face. His hands stopped on the desk, and for a moment he seemed not to want to reply. Then he pulled himself up and said, "A sad loss. Sir Alaric was a man of serious personality, yet of strong beliefs. The moor has swallowed him as it swallows many." Holmes's eyes narrowed almost too small to see. "It is not the moor we suspect, but men who move on it. You, Mr. Kettle, were with him often. What subjects did you talk about?" Kettle's lips pressed together, and when he spoke, his words came out measured, careful. "We spoke of ideas, of duty, of the nature of man, and the temptations of the world. Sir Alaric was very troubled lately. He told me that he had made a deal that he regretted, though he did not name the other person." Holmes walked slowly between the desks, his fingers trailing lightly along their edges. "And in these talks, did he ever show fear? Fear of being punished? Fear of being betrayed?" Kettle paused, then tilted his head. "Yes. On the last night I saw him, he grabbed my arm and whispered, 'Beware the blackbird.' I thought he was speaking in a riddle, perhaps of some inner pain. But now, with what has happened to him—" He stopped, shaking his head. Holmes's gaze sharpened. "Beware the blackbird. You are certain of his words?" "As certain as I am of my own name." The silence that followed was heavy. The moan of the wind outside crept through the gaps in the shutters, mixing with the dim sound of a child's laughter coming from the cottages beyond. The difference between that innocent sound and the dark subject before us struck me with a strange force. Holmes at last turned to Kettle. "You have been honest, and I thank you. But I must push further. Did Sir Alaric ever speak of debts, of deals tied not to ideas, but to money?" For the first time, Kettle's calmness broke. His gaze dropped, his hands clenched on the desk. He spoke of a sum of money, large, urgent, owed to a man who would not forgive. But he swore he would solve it without shame. That is all I know." Holmes studied him for a long moment, then tilted his head and turned toward the door. "Very well. You have given us much to think about. I will not keep you any longer." We stepped back into the raw air, the moor stretching gloomily beyond. Holmes's face was thoughtful, his eyes gleaming with a light I knew well. "Watson," he said softly, "we have moved a step closer. A warning, a blackbird, and a debt. The pattern begins to show, but the hand that wove it remains hidden. That night the moor lay in a silence so deep it seemed almost unnatural, as though the land itself held its breath. The moon hung low and pale above the horizon, hidden by drifting clouds, casting a ghostly light on the endless flowers. Holmes and I had returned from the village with our thoughts heavy with Kettle's words. Yet no sooner had we set foot inside Blackthorn House than Holmes declared that the night was too good an opportunity to waste. "Watson," he said, "ghosts walk more freely when they believe they are not being seen. Let us see if the moor chooses to show its secrets under the cover of darkness." Though I did not want to go, I could not deny the excitement that stirred inside me. We armed ourselves with strong sticks and a lantern, though Holmes carried his unlit, insisting that darkness was at times a more useful friend than light. Fairfax, pale and clearly unwilling, begged to stay behind, which Holmes allowed with a short nod. And so it was that we too went out into the chilly night air, the gravel of the path crunching underfoot as the moor opened before us like a dark sea. The silence was broken only by the distant cry of an owl and the soft hiss of the wind across the bog. The flowers brushed against our boots as we pushed forward, their smell sharp and earthy, mixing with the faint smell of peat carried on the air. We walked in silence, Holmes pausing now and then to crouch low, his eyes scanning the ground for signs I could not see. At last he raised a hand, telling me to stop. "Do you hear it, Watson?" he whispered. At first, I heard nothing beyond the sighing of the wind. Then, faint and shaky, there came a sound unlike any I'd ever heard. It was a cry, low, sad, and strangely human, yet twisted as though echoed through some huge hollow. It rose, shook, and sank again, leaving behind an echo that seemed to stay in my very bones. I admit I shivered. "Good heavens, Holmes, what is it?" He stayed completely still, his head tilted, his eyes narrowing in focus. "A sound, Watson, that is meant to create terror, and indeed it works. But whether it is born of wind, of animal, or of men, I cannot yet tell." We pushed on, guided by that eerie call, until we came upon a small hill looking over a dip in the moor. There, dim against the darkness, a light drifted, faint, flickering, moving with an unnatural steadiness across the bog. It hovered low, skimming the ground in a way no human holding it could manage. For a moment my heart hammered against my ribs, for it seemed indeed as though we looked at some unearthly ghost. The lantern, if it was a lantern, glowed with a pale flame, moving with smooth, steady purpose, neither shaking nor flaring as a handheld light would. Holmes's grip tightened on my arm. His voice, though low, carried a thrill of energy. "There, Watson, the ghost lantern the villagers speak of. But notice, its path is too straight, its movement too regular. No ghost walks so perfectly. That light, I promise you, is guided by a plan." We watched in silence as the glow traced its way across the hollow, pausing briefly, then vanishing as suddenly as if it had been put out by an unseen hand. The moor returned to darkness. The cry faded into silence, and only the wind remained, restless and cold. Holmes released my arm, his eyes gleaming in the moonlight. "We are near the truth, Watson. The ghost walks, but not because nature wants it to." For some moments, after the light vanished, we stayed completely still, as though the moor itself had turned to stone. Holmes crouched, his eyes fixed on the hollow below, every muscle tight with the readiness of a hunter waiting for his target. I admit my own nerves were so tight that every rustle of flowers behind us, every sigh of the wind, seemed like the step of some unseen chaser. At last Holmes stood up silently and began to go down the slope, his movement quick yet careful. I followed close behind, my heart thudding in my ears. The hollow was dangerous, its ground soft with hidden pools of water that grabbed at our boots. Holmes moved forward with the exactness of a man, tracing not just the land, but an invisible logic that guided his every step. At the point where the light had hovered, he knelt and pressed his hands against the earth. "Here, Watson," he whispered. "The soil is firm enough to hold a man's step, yet too dangerous for a lantern to be carried with such steadiness." The light we saw was no wandering spirit, but a trick hung, I suspect, on a rope stretched between these two stones. He pointed toward a pair of worn rock formations, their surfaces worn smooth by centuries of wind. "Notice the faint scrape on the rock, a sign of rubbing." The lamp was guided, swung perhaps by a hand hidden at the edge of the moor. The thought that the ghost was not a ghost, but the planned work of human cleverness, struck me with both relief and worry. But for what purpose, Holmes? Why work to create a ghost on the moor? Holmes's eyes gleamed in the pale light. "To weave fear, my dear Watson, and fear, as I told you, is a lever by which men may be moved to act against their good sense. Sir Alaric, already restless, already troubled by unseen debts, would be more open to such terrors. A trembling heart makes easy prey." He stood up, his cloak brushing the flowers, and turned his gaze toward the dark shape of Blackthorn House looming on the hill. "We must ask ourselves who benefits from such tricks, and who has both the smarts and the boldness to make them. That, Watson, will lead us closer to the truth than all the moor's shadows." As he spoke, the sad cry we had heard before sounded once more, closer this time, rising from the very depths of the bog. It echoed across the hollow, sounding like a funeral song. My hand went instinctively to my revolver, but Holmes placed a steadying hand on my arm. "Control yourself. The sound is as fake as the light. A horn, perhaps, or some reed toy hidden among the reeds to catch the wind and make its voice louder. Clever, yet not beyond what a human can invent." We searched the hollow by lantern, finding at last a bundle of reeds tied with string, half hidden in the swamp. When the wind passed through them, they made a low, wailing sound, strangely like a human cry. Holmes held the toy up high, his lips curling in a cold smile. "Look, the ghost's voice. A simple trick, yet devilishly good in the lonely hours of the night." We returned to the house with this discovery, the path winding through the flowers like a ribbon of darkness. The moor seemed to brood in silence behind us, as though angry that its secrets were laid bare. As we neared the gates of Blackthorn House, Holmes spoke once more, his voice low but determined. "We are no longer dealing with the unknown, Watson, but with a mind that is clever, calculating, and ruthless. The ghost of the moor is no ghost, but a man of flesh and blood, and I plan to unmask him." A morning that followed our night trip dawned gloomy and colorless, the moor stretching under a sky the color of dull gray metal. Holmes, energized by his discovery, wasted no time in drawing me once more into the wilds. He carried with him a small spade borrowed from Fairfax's supplies, and his eyes gleamed with that restless brightness I had come to know, the look of a man whose mind raced several steps ahead of normal understanding. "We have seen the ghost's props," he said, as we went down the slope toward the bog. "Now let us look for its heart. Fear is not planted on the wind, Watson. It needs roots. I believe those roots lie buried not far from where the fake lantern swung." We walked back to the hollow from the night before. The reeds still whispered faintly in the breeze, though the toy Holmes had discovered now lay taken apart in his coat pocket. He paced the ground slowly, pausing now and then to poke the soil with the tip of his stick, as though listening to some hidden language under the surface. At last he stopped on a patch where the flowers grew thin and the earth sagged slightly, as if pressed down by weight. "Here," he declared. "Do you notice the difference in color? The soil is darker, the plants are fewer. Something lies beneath, Watson. Help me." Together we set to work, the spade biting into the damp ground. The smell of peat and old water rose sharply, mixing with the flowers' perfume. The earth gave way slowly, but after several minutes of work, the blade struck against something harder than soil. Holmes dropped to his knees, brushing away the clumps of dirt with his long fingers. A corner of rotted wood appeared, then more, until the outline of a chest was revealed, half buried in the mud. With effort, we pulled it out. The wood was blackened by damp, its iron bands rusted, yet the lock was still unbroken. Holmes checked it keenly. A chest of some age, but not from too long ago. The soil has not had time to swallow it completely. Someone placed this here on purpose, and not long ago. From his pocket, he took out a thin tool and set to work on the lock. In a few moments, it gave way with a reluctant snap. He threw back the lid, and we both leaned forward to see. Inside lay bundles of papers, their edges curled with damp, and under them, to my surprise, rolls of money tied with string, their print blurred, but their value clear. There were also several objects wrapped in cloth, which when unrolled, showed silver decorations of a strange design, as though stolen from some old hall or church. Holmes's eyes shone. Here lies the answer to Sir Alaric's debts, Watson. Not the payment of them, but their cause. This is no honest storage, but the profits of crime, hidden away on the moor, where no one but the clever hand that placed it would ever think to search. A chill passed through me, though the air was still. Then Sir Alaric was involved in this? I asked. Holmes replaced the papers carefully, his face unreadable. Involved, perhaps. A victim, most certainly. Whether he was a partner or a target, that is still to be seen. But mark my words, Watson. Whoever buried this chest on the moor has a hand in his death, and I mean to learn whose hand it was. He stood up, his coat whipping in the wind, the open chest at his feet like a wound torn in the earth. The moor stretched around us, silent and huge, as though holding its secrets back. Yet one of those secrets had now been forced to the surface, and I could not escape the feeling that our discovery had started things we barely understood. Holmes closed the chest once more, and tied it with a piece of rope he had smartly brought along, leaving it half hidden among the reeds until we could arrange to have it removed. He stood with arms folded, staring across the moor with the look of a man who sees not the scene in front of him, but the hidden story that lies beneath. "You see, Watson," he said at last, "that Sir Alaric's death was not a sudden accident, nor the silly idea of frightened villagers. It is the end of a plan that has been woven for a long time. Money, illegal goods, stolen treasures, all buried beneath the flowers. Our job is to trace the string from this chest to the hand that placed it here, and then to the shadow that put out Sir Alaric's life." As we turned back toward the house, the moor seemed changed in my eyes. What had once seemed a wilderness of nature now showed the marks of human plotting. Every hill, every hollow, every group of rocks seemed a possible hiding place for some further secret. The very silence of the place took on an evil personality, as though it was helping to protect the guilty. When we reached Blackthorn House, Fairfax was waiting for us in the hall, his face pale, his eyes haunted. He jumped when he saw the mud on our boots and the spade in Holmes's hand. "You have found something," he said in a low voice, more a statement than a question. Holmes looked at him steadily. "We have indeed. And you, Mr. Fairfax, must now answer clearly. Did you know about the chest buried on the moor?" The manager's face lost what little color it had. He swayed as though he'd been hit, then caught the edge of the table for support. "No, by heaven, no. I swear I knew nothing of it. But Sir Alaric, he would ride often in that direction, returning late and tired. I thought it was just his habit, a way to be alone. If he hid such a thing, he hid it even from me." Holmes's expression softened, though his eyes stayed sharp. "I believe you. Yet your master's restless pacing, his whispered deals, his fear these point to knowing of a danger greater than being alone could provide. He may have been trapped in a web woven by another, one who profited while he suffered. Fairfax bowed his head, his hands trembling. Then I failed him, Mr. Holmes. I should have seen. I should have asked. Holmes placed a hand on the man's shoulder, not unkindly. Do not blame yourself too much. The most loyal of servants cannot see through the curtain when a master chooses to pull it tight. But now, Fairfax, we must push on those who are left. Bring us a list of all who had a reason to visit the house these last months. Every repairman, every friend, no matter how unimportant. When the manager had gone, Holmes turned to me, his face lit up with determination. Watson, we are on the edge of the answer. The ghost's wings, the warning note, the buried chest. These are not separate strings, but parts of one great plan. Tonight we shall watch them all once more, and if luck is with us, the writer of these tricks shall step into the open. That night, as the lamps of the house flickered against the growing darkness, I could not get rid of the image of the chest lying hidden in the flowers, its damp wood swollen with secrets. The wind moaned around the chimneys, carrying with it the smell of peat and rain. Somewhere out on the moor, I felt certain the hand that had buried that chest was stirring uneasily, aware that its hiding place had been discovered. The night was darker than any we had yet lived through on the moor. A storm had gathered in the west, its clouds blocking out the stars, its wind driving the flowers into restless waves. Inside Blackthorn House, the servants had gone to bed early, afraid of the hour, and Fairfax, though brave in spirit, moved with the haunted look of one who expects a disaster at every knock of the shutter. Holmes, however, seemed almost thrilled. His lantern, carefully shaded, stood ready on the table, and his sharp eyes gleamed with excitement for what the night might bring. Watson, he said, pulling his cloak around him, the hunter must become as silent as the hunted. We will take our spot by the rocks where the lantern swung. If our enemy believes his tricks still work, he may try to create them once more. And when he does, he tapped his fingers together with that familiar look that meant his net was nearly closed. We set out shortly before midnight, the air heavy with the smell of coming rain. The moor stretched before us like a sea of shadows, the flowers bending low under the weight of the strong wind. Holmes led the way with swift, silent steps, barely seeming to bother the ground under his feet. I followed close, my revolver ready, though every gust of wind made me jump at ghost sounds. At last we reached the hollow. The stones looked black against the sky, and the ground around them glistened with dampness. Holmes crouched low, signaling me to do the same. We put out our lantern and waited, the storm muttering faintly in the distance. The silence grew heavy, broken only by the whistle of the wind through the reeds. Then, faint at first, but impossible to miss, the sad cry rose once more, a long, shaky note that seemed to shiver through my bones. It was followed by the sudden flare of light, pale and steady, gliding once again across the bog. The ghost had returned. Holmes's hand gripped my sleeve, telling me to be patient. We watched as the light traced its path, swinging with measured exactness. Then, from behind the stones, a darker figure moved, low, swift, almost crawling. My breath caught, for here at last was no ghost, but a man. His body was cloaked, his head bent, and in his hands he worked the rope on which the lantern was strung. Holmes sprang forward with a cry, as fast as a hawk swooping on its prey. The figure jumped, dropping the rope, and ran across the flowers. I chased after him at Holmes's side, the ground dangerous under our boots, the wind tearing at our cloaks. The runaway ran with desperate speed, darting among the stones, his shape blocked by the darkness. Yet Holmes pushed on with tireless energy. Suddenly, the man stumbled, his foot catching in a hole, and in that instant Holmes was on him. They fought on the ground, the man hitting wildly, Holmes cool and planned, controlling him with the exactness of a trained wrestler. I arrived breathless, revolver in hand, and together we dragged the man into the dim glow of the fallen lantern. The light showed a face pale with effort, framed by dark hair stuck together with sweat. It was Henry Kettle, the schoolteacher. His eyes flashed with both fear and defiance, his chest rising and falling as he struggled in Holmes's grasp. "So, sir," Holmes murmured, his voice low but edged with victory, "the ghost of the Moor walks on two very human feet." Kettle spat on the ground. "You know nothing, Holmes, nothing. The Moor belongs to those who understand it. Sir Alaric was a fool, and fools pay their price." Holmes tightened his grip, his gaze like steel. "On the contrary, Mr. Kettle, I know enough to tie the strings of your web. But tomorrow, when the daylight shines on your actions, all the village shall know as well." We tied Kettle's hands with a piece of rope Holmes carried for such times, and he sat on the damp earth, his face pale in the lantern glow, yet set in defiance. The wind tore at his cloak. The reeds whispered like partners in crime, and for a moment the huge emptiness of the moor seemed to hold its breath, as though listening to the struggle between truth and hiding. Holmes looked at the man coolly. "You are clever, Kettle. Clever enough to make voices from reeds and ghosts from lanterns. Clever enough to dress up old stories in such a way that even the bravest hearts shook. But your cleverness gave you away. The path of the light was too regular, the cry too machine-like. Nature is never so exact. It was the trick of a schoolteacher who mistakes logic for imagination." Kettle's lips curved into a bitter smile. "You think you are my master, Holmes, but you know only half. Sir Alaric was doomed long before I set foot on the moor. He was trapped in bets that would have broken him, bets owed to men far more ruthless than I." Holmes's eyes gleamed. "Ah, so there are others in this play. You are just an actor, not the writer. Then tell me, who held Sir Alaric in their grasp? Whose hand demanded the price of his ruin?" But Kettle only shook his head, his eyes glittering with a strange pride. "I will not speak. Let the Moor keep its secrets." Holmes bent closer, his voice low and deliberate. "You are mistaken, sir. The Moor keeps nothing. It gives up its secrets slowly to those who listen. Already we have dug up the chest you thought was hidden forever." For the first time, Kettle's calmness broke. His eyes widened, his breath caught loudly. "The chest," he whispered. "You found it." Holmes's lips curved in satisfaction. "Indeed. Its contents speak loudly enough, even without your confession. Fake money, stolen silver, treasures from old halls, all the currency of a secret plan. Sir Alaric may have been drawn into your net, but you and your friends wove the strings." Kettle's shoulders sagged. The wind moaned across the moor, carrying his voice with it, when at last he spoke. He was not innocent. He wanted to get rich as greedily as any of us. But when his courage failed, when he threatened to confess, he sealed his own fate. It was not I who silenced him. It was fear itself. We showed him the light, the bird, the cry, and his own heart did the rest." Holmes's face hardened. "Then you confessed to a plot to terrify, to break him, perhaps even to drive him to his death." Kettle gave a tired laugh. "Call it what you will. The Moor takes those who are weak." Holmes straightened, his eyes lit with cold fire. "No, sir. The Moor takes nothing. It is men such as you who take in its name, and for that you shall answer." We pulled the prisoner to his feet and led him back to our Blackthorn house, the lantern swinging at Holmes's side. The storm had broken for real, rain lashing our faces, thunder rolling over the endless land. Yet even as the weather raged, I felt that the true storm lay not in the sky, but within the tangled web Holmes now tried to untangle. As we entered the house, Fairfax looked up in shock at the wet figure we pushed before him. Holmes laid a firm hand on the manager's shoulder. "This man has played the ghost, but mark my words, Fairfax, the hand that pulled Sir Alaric to ruin has not yet been revealed. The web is wider still, and tomorrow we shall see it tighten around the true writer of this crime." The storm had not completely passed when morning crept gray over the moor, though the thunder had faded into grumpy grumbles on the horizon. Rainwater glistened in every hollow, and the air carried that raw smell of earth, freshly torn open by the night's anger. Inside Blackthorn House, the servants moved with quiet steps, whispering of the prisoner held in a locked room. Henry Kettle had spent the dark hours in silence, his face set in that strange defiance we had seen on the moor. Holmes, however, was restless. He paced the great hall with the energy of a man who senses his target is near, yet not fully in his grasp. At times he would pause, his gaze fixed on the high-backed chair where Sir Alaric had met his death, as though the silent figure of the master still sat there, waiting to give the final clue. By mid-morning, Inspector Lestrade arrived from Scotland Yard, having been called by telegram at Holmes's strong request. He entered quickly, his coat still damp from the journey, his manner both official and slightly annoyed, as though he was used to Holmes's strange calls. "Well, Mr. Holmes," he said, "you have dragged me out into the wilderness once again. What trouble have you dug up this time?" Holmes tilted his head with the slightest hint of amusement. "Only the untangling of a secret plan that covered itself in feathers and fog. You will find the prisoner safe, Inspector, though he is but one string in a larger rope. The real ending is yet to come." Lestrade muttered something about drama, but I noticed how his eyes followed Holmes with tired respect, for he too had seen enough of my friend's victories to not trust his doubts. Together we went up to the room where Kettle sat tied up. His eyes gleamed with a mix of disrespect and tiredness, but he held his tongue, even under Lestrade's sharp questioning. Holmes, not bothered, just looked at him for a moment before turning sharply toward Fairfax. "Mr. Fairfax, you have been loyal to your master, yet there are things you have kept back. The time for silence is over. Tell us who besides Kettle visited Sir Alaric in those final days." Fairfax hesitated, his hands trembling, his face as pale as paper. At last he whispered, "There was one other, a man who came often at dusk when the servants had gone to bed. I thought it strange, yet Sir Alaric ordered me to be silent. His name was Harwood, Jonas Harwood, a seller of old treasures." Holmes's eyes flashed. Harwood, the very name whispered in the markets of London when stolen treasures change hands. "Watson, you remember the chest. We have our man." Lestrade jumped. "Do you mean to tell me, Holmes, that this whole thing is tied to smuggling?" "More than smuggling, Inspector. It is greed, wrapped in the clothes of old stories. Harwood supplied the treasures, Kettle the tricks, and together they trapped Sir Alaric in debts that grew until his courage broke. But when he decided to confess, they struck, not with a knife or poison, but with terror more deadly still. A hush fell upon the room, broken only by the distant drip of rain on the roof. Fairfax looked heartbroken, his head bowed, while Lestrade muttered a curse under his breath. Holmes stood tall, his face set with cold determination. "Today, gentlemen, the web draws closed. Harwood is in the village, and by this night he shall answer for his crimes on the very edge of the moor he thought he controlled." We set out in the fading light of day, Holmes, Lestrade, and I, with Fairfax trailing behind, as though forced by fate to see the matter through. The village lay in a worried quiet, its cottages huddled close against the wind. From the inn, we learned quickly that Harwood had been seen on the moor's edge, heading for Blackthorn House, with the confidence of someone who believed his power was not challenged. Holmes's lips tightened, and without a pause, we turned our steps toward the empty hill. The path wound steeply upward, the moor stretching away in gloomy greatness, the flowers darkened by rain, the bogs gleaming with hidden water. The storm's leftovers clung in the air, and the low clouds pressed so near that it seemed we walked under a ceiling of stone. Soon we saw him, Jonas Harwood, standing tall on the hill, his cloak thrown back, his face stern and hawk-like. In his hand he carried a staff of polished wood, and his eyes gleamed with the cold sureness of one who has long done well by being clever. Holmes stepped forward, his voice clear and cutting. "Jonas Harwood, your game is over. The chest lies open. Your partner is caught, and the web you wove has torn on its own lies. Give yourself up to the law." Harwood laughed, a sound as harsh as the wind itself. "The law? The moor is my law. It has swallowed men greater than you, Holmes. Who among you dares lay hands on me here?" Lestrade moved forward, his hand on his revolver. But Holmes lifted his arm to stop him. "You cannot run from the truth, Harwood. Your ghosts have failed. Your tricks are unmasked. The fear that killed Sir Alaric cannot protect you now." Harwood's eyes flashed with anger. Alaric was weak. He wanted to get rich, yet lacked the strength to handle the price. I offered him riches, power drawn from treasures men would pay fortunes to own. He faltered, spoke of confessing, and so he died. The moor took him because I wanted it to. His voice rose in a cry, half victorious, half mad, carrying across the flowers, like the wail of the fake reeds he had once made. At that instant, Holmes walked forward, his figure stark against the gloom, his hand held out with the calm power that allows no argument. "Enough," he said. "Your words find you more guilty than any jury. The moor is no kingdom, Harwood. It is just earth and water, and here on its edge you stand not as a master, but as a man brought down by his own greed." For a heartbeat, Harwood faltered, his staff trembling in his grasp. Then, with a desperate cry, he turned to run across the bog. But the ground, wet from the storm, betrayed him. His foot sank deep, his body pitching forward. We rushed to grab him, Lestrade grasping his arm as he struggled, and with effort we dragged him back to firm ground. His cloak was torn, his face smeared with peat, the proud defiance gone from his eyes. It was like this, broken and defeated, that Jonas Harwood was taken into custody. The villagers, called by the noise, gathered to see him led away, their fear turning into murmurs of surprise and relief. The ghost of the moor was no spirit after all, but a man of flesh whose plans had at last fallen apart. That night, as we sat once more in the dim hall of Blackthorn House, Holmes allowed himself a rare moment of thought. "You see, Watson," he said quietly, "how men dress their crimes in the clothes of legend, and how easily fear helps guilt. Yet in the end, truth is the sharper blade. Sir Alaric paid dearly for getting mixed up in this. But his death has torn the cover from a secret plan that might otherwise have spread without being stopped." I looked toward the shuttered windows, beyond which the moor lay silent at last. The wind had fallen, the reeds were still, and the darkness no longer seemed filled with shadows. Yet the memory of that sad cry, of the drifting light across the bog, would haunt me long after. For though we had brought men to justice, the moor itself remained what it always was, huge, mysterious, and not caring about the fates of those who dared to walk its edge.